Okay. Hi, good evening. My name is Nina Avenal, and I'm a program manager here at IEA. Thank you so much for making it this evening, whether you're a new parent or a returning family who's attending. We continue to appreciate really people who support these gifted support groups meetings, which happen once a month. Are there, just a show of hands, new families joining us? Okay, great. Oh, okay, almost half the audience. So if you're not familiar with gifted support group meetings, these were really developed so that we can provide an open and safe forum for parents and educators with gifted children to share the challenges and the joys that they experience either raising a gifted child or working with a gifted child. We also invite experts in the field of gifted education to share either their research or their experiences working with gifted students and try to provide some insight to parents and educators. So this is really an open discussion. And we welcome questions that you may have along the way, either at the end or during the presentation. This is also being live streamed, so we do have families who are not local to us who really want the opportunity to hear about some of the people and the resources that are out there for their gifted children. So we are live on Facebook today, and this recording will be available after the meeting. So in case you feel like you missed something, you can view it again on our Facebook at IEA Gifted. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker tonight, Rebecca Gotlieb. She is a current PhD candidate at USC, and she'll be sharing social-emotional imagination in gifted education. Take it away.
So thank you, Nina, for the introduction, and thank you guys for being here. I know that on a rainy Thursday night, it takes some effort to come out here, and I'm glad for you all sharing the evening with me. As Nina said, I'm a PhD student at USC. I study social and emotional development during adolescence, and I do so from a perspective that combines what's happening in the bodies and brains and minds and cultural contexts, because at the mix of those things is our best bet for understanding how people are developing and how we can support that process. So I understand that you all are parents of gifted students, and oftentimes parents of gifted students can appreciate that there's something very special about their child, that they have exceptional talents or abilities, intellectual and creative potential, but there still may be concerns about how they can help their child fully realize that potential and how others can see the extent to which others see that potential in their child. So today I'm going to be talking about how social emotional skills may be the key to unlocking that potential and helping it really shine in students. I'll be focusing especially on the role of these skills in bringing out students' creative potential. So to begin, I'd like to tell you all a story, and then I'll ask you to turn to someone near you and talk about it for a minute, and then we'll come back together. This is a story of a 15-year-old boy in Sierra Leone in Western Africa who grew up in a small, impoverished town without consistent access to electricity, without consistent access to clean running water. And the area where he is from has been facing civil unrest for over a decade. So one day he and his mom were going to the open air market, and rebel fighters came down from the mountain region and started opening fire. And his mom was caught in the crosshair and died later that day. And after that experience, this boy was really committed to doing something to help his community. He didn't want others to face the devastating circumstances that he had. And so eventually what he did is he went to the business district of the neighboring area and started collecting broken, discarded electronics, and would take them apart and figure out how they work, put them back together, and he started building things with these electronics he gathered. So he built a radio for himself, he started building batteries, and he built a few of these to give to his friends and family. And eventually he built a radio, he started a radio station. He wanted his community to have a place where they could debate how to handle the issues that were affecting them and have a forum to talk about how to improve their situation. So I'm going to pull up a brief video from him so we can hear in his own words what he says about his experience.
I'm from Sierra Leone, and I love inventing.
He literally goes to trash cans, finds broken electronic parts in the garbage, and makes stuff on his own.
In Sierra Leone, we have not so much electricity. Lights will come out once in a week, and the rest of the month dark. So I made my own battery to power lights in people's houses. I made my own FM radio transmitter.
He made his own FM station because he wanted to give voice to the youth.
If we have a radio station in my community, the people can be able to debate about issues affecting our community and Sierra Leone as a whole.
I miss my family so much, especially my mother. Just love my family. My next invention will be a windmill for people to use for electricity and supply. That is my aim, to promote innovation in Sierra Leone among young people.
So take a minute, if you will, and talk with someone nearby about how that story makes you feel.
Appreciative, but also that inspiring that like
for me, it's hopeful doing something good, you know, in the arts makes me curious. I'm curious, like knowledge. It's sort of a small picture, so yeah, it sounds like it's very right. Create that part of that school or something.
But yeah, we're just definitely and it's children like yeah, to inspire.
So great. Well, thank you all for indulging in that. Hold on to those thoughts, and I want to come back to that again at the end. But what I'd like to talk about together right now are what are some of the factors that you heard or saw in this story that led to this young man's success? How was he able to accomplish what it is that he accomplished?
Relevant and meaningful learning, right? So that knowing that what you're doing matters.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So it felt important. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I was thinking that pure survival. He was probably just tinkering around in the junkyard looking to see what he could salvage.
Mm-hmm.
And then with obviously a brilliant mind, he was able to, you know, think through some ways to use this junk to actually make money, help himself and help his family, and then his community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are both really good points, and what I hear in there in your responses is you mentioned incidentally that he was likely very bright, but you also both focused on these other skills that he had that led to his success. So I think in the example from this boy, it's really clear how things like having a vision for a better future and the confidence to believe that you can contribute to it and the tenacity to work towards it and the creativity to try new things to try to bring it about are really important and in this case may outweigh just pure intelligence in bringing about his success. Sorry. There we go. So I'd like to get into talking about what social and emotional imagination is, but first I just want to clear the air about something. Thanks to Descartes, there is a deep-seated tradition in our culture of believing that emotion and reason are separate, and that hot emotions can only interfere with the type of cool reasoning and learning that we are trying to instill and hone in school settings. But what we see from the last decade or more, two or more, in both neuroscience and psychological research is that that couldn't be further from the truth. In actuality, the two are inextricably entwined. Without good emotional intuitions, we can't make rational decisions. And similarly, without cognition to guide it's the cognitive component of the emotional processes that make emotion so powerful for learning. We can think of it kind of as the emotions being this rudder that guide the ship of our learning processes. Sorry, I'm still getting. Okay, sorry about this. So over the last couple of years, my colleagues and I have been building out this construct of social-emotional imagination. Essentially, it's the ability to consider multiple cognitive and affective perspectives and courses of action and outcomes for yourself and others. And we define it as having 5 main components, which I'll go through in further detail. But those are perspection, the ability to simulate futures, flexible identity construction, building a sense of who we are at our core, as well as being able to conceive of ourselves broadly. Constructive internal reflection, making meaning of the daily encounters that we have and situating that in our own values. Perspective taking, so imagining what others are thinking or feeling, and polycultural thinking, thinking with an appreciation of multiple cultural contexts. And we'll see that these are both, these are key both to identifying and supporting gifted education, but are typically an omitted part of it. So before I fully go into detail on those 5 components of social emotional imagination, I want to take a step back to understand more about what's happening in our brains that are guiding behaviors relevant to these skills. So there are 3 main networks that we'll focus on today. What I mean by network is a group of areas in the brain that work together to accomplish a task. So they're distributed, but they're all functioning in sync with each other. So the first network is the default mode network, and it's composed of some regions along the middle of the brain, down where your heart might be, as well as on the sides. And it got its name because neuroscientists first realized that this network existed because when they were going to scan people in an fMRI, typically before they start the task, they're just waiting around in the scanner, seemingly doing nothing, waiting to be told what they're supposed to do. And they found that this network was consistently activating when these people were just lying there waiting. So other than breathing and that sort of thing, what are our minds doing when it looks on the outside like we're not doing anything at all?
Reviewing and planning.
Yep, reviewing, planning, wondering, exactly. So the default mode network supports our ability to mind wander, to imagine futures and think about the past, and make meaning of our circumstances. The executive attention network, on the other hand, is involved in thinking and acting in the here and now. It has to do with how we react to our present circumstances. And the salience network, which has hubs kind of on this deep inner fold in the brain here, is involved with directing our attention and switching between the other 2 networks. So typically, the executive attention network has been, it's been privileged in gifted education, in that this is the network that would be involved in us taking a standardized assessment or taking an IQ test. But the default mode network, which has hubs in each of the labeled areas here, is involved in our ability to engage in innovative and ethical thinking. It's a complement to the executive attention network, and yet one that we're not investing in to the same extent. So what we know about how these networks work is that typically when one is active, the other is deactivated. They kind of have this dance where only one is really at play at once. And so the implication for gifted education may be that both of these are important, but we need to we need to be investing in both, and we need to be investing in helping people understand how to skillfully and appropriately switch between these two networks, rather than just putting all our eggs into one basket, so to speak. Although just to kind of throw a wrinkle into things, although typically these networks have act such that one is active and the other is deactivated, in the context of creative thinking, we actually see something unique happen where the two networks cooperate to a larger extent than is usually the case, which again is why it's really important that we invest in both of these. And just to re-emphasize this point about the importance of balance in these two networks, it's not just in what we're doing in gifted education that it matters that we invest in both, but also in how we think about who's invited into gifted education. So in almost all the states in the country, gifted education is primarily or exclusively based on intelligence or standardized assessments. In California, it's typically recommended that it be based on more than just that, but those are still the primary considerations. And those kinds of assessments have historical inequities built into them. And that may explain to some extent why we also see inequities in who's invited into gifted education. The same is not true of assessments of creativity. So a number of different types of creativity have not been shown, tests of creativity have not been shown to have those same cultural differences in performance. And so if we were to think about expanding how we're defining the criteria for inclusion into gifted education, we might take a step towards addressing that problem of inequity in who's invited. So I'd like to switch now to talking about these 5 different components of the social-emotional imagination. The first I want to talk about is perspection. This is the ability to pre-experience, if you will, that which has yet to happen. So it's engaging in mental simulations about our own lives, about ideas that have yet to come to fruition, or imagining navigating paths. And these simulations are exactly what we know the default mode network is supporting. So why is it important that that this skill of perspection, like what value does it have for us? The basic idea here is that the ability to imagine the future is a step towards building that future. For example, researchers have looked at low income minority middle school students in a big urban middle school, and compared those who had a vision for their future, for who they wanted to be, and an understanding of how they might get there with other middle school students who didn't have a similar vision for their future. And they found that those students who had a more robust vision for their future were more likely to engage in behaviors that were productive for building that future. So they were spending more time on their homework, they were participating more in class, and they were even getting better grades. And we see this play out. I was assuming you would say that also could be taught. It's not. Yes, I mean, definitely. There's intervention work that's done to help students build out this future. And one of the things that we can be doing to support the development of this skill and help kids more generally is having them envision a path to their goals. We see this play out too in other contexts. So for example, having high school students participate in career development workshops has been shown to make them want to consider a greater range of possible careers, including less typical ones, and more interested in engaging in career exploration generally. So making space in gifted education for students to imagine freely what they aspire to and help them get there is important, and especially so for people who may not have as clear or obvious or present adult role models of possible desirable future selves. And the benefits of engaging in this kind of simulation play out in big and small ways. So I'm guessing someone in the room has likely heard of the Marshmallow Test.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I hear yes, I hear some nodding heads.
And all the flip-flopping now on it.
Yes, yep. So there has been a back and forth about the validity of some of it, and that probably comes down to we need to be considering context to a greater extent. But the basic premise of the Marshmallow Task is that a psychology researcher offers a kid a tasty treat of their choosing, and they say that they can have the treat now, but if they are able to wait until the researcher comes back, then they can have 2 of those treats. And lest you think that psychology researchers are evil, I think really most of the kids get 2 treats no matter what, but they don't know that in advance. And then they look at whether the kids delay, the strategies that they employ to delay, and look at outcomes later. A research group in New Zealand and the town circled in red down below have been following a cohort of more than 1,000 kids born in the 70s. I believe they're still following them today. And when these kids were about 10 years old, they had them do a variation of this well-known marshmallow task. And then they followed up with the kids more than 20 years later when they were adults in their mid-30s and looked at their life outcomes at that point. What they found was that the kids who at 10 years old were better able to imagine alternative scenarios to take them out of the hot feeling of here and now, of the desires they had at the moment, and instead could imagine either themselves being happier in the future with the 2 treats, or just imagine an alternative scenario so they weren't feeling the pressure of what they wanted in the moment, were doing better in all kinds of ways. So they those kids who had delayed the gratification showed better health outcomes. They were in a better financial situation. They were less likely to be unplanned single parents, and they were less likely to have a criminal record. So this prospection seems to be providing us with some good things. But another component of social emotional imagination is the constructive internal reflection, the ability to make meaning of our daily encounters. Essentially, the idea here is that we want to try to connect the complex ideas about our own values and beliefs with our everyday experiences, and use the understanding of how our beliefs and values relate to what we're experiencing to inform our action. And again, this kind of reflection is exactly what we know the default mode network is supporting. So one question is this type of reflection something that requires mindfulness, or is it something that requires mindlessness, mind wandering? And the answer is a little complicated. It's both. What we're seeing is that with greater mindfulness, the way in which that executive attention network is communicating with the subcomponents of the default mode network changes. So it communicates more with some parts of it and less with others. And what we think that's what's happening there is that this process of mindfulness is helping us quiet our internal critic, and helping us kind of be able to push forward with thinking about pursuing the innovative ideas that we might have. But mind wandering has benefits too. Across cultures and across countries, people spend almost half of their waking hours mind wandering. So we would think that something we spend so much time doing is likely serving us well in some ways. And that does seem to be the case. One big example is those aha moments that we have, those moments of insight where we have a breakthrough. So, certainly we've heard the lore of Isaac Newton, for example, with being hit on the head by awoken from a nap with an apple falling on his head and having these just revelations about gravity, or allegedly Paul McCartney woke up one morning with the tune and lyrics to the song Yesterday nearly fully formed. Of course, in these cases, there are years of preparation and skill development in the field that are going into the person being prepared to have that moment of insight. But acutely, it seems to be letting our mind wander freely that allows for that breakthrough to happen. So it seems like they both have their benefits. The mind wandering is helping us in the moment, and the mindfulness is helping us be less self-critical so that we can develop this wisdom that allows for a slower and more protracted form of creativity to develop. So with an understanding of how our beliefs and values relate to our daily experiences, we can develop greater confidence. And confidence is one of the skills that is really valuable for achieving greater success. We know, for example, that greater connectivity among regions within the default mode network while completing a challenging task is associated with less self-doubt on that task, and then in turn, greater performance on the task. Another part downstream effect of engaging in this constructive internal reflection is an appreciation for what we're interested in. And sparking interest is really important for going on to achieve at high levels. A research team divided a class of 9th grade science students into 2 groups. They asked half of the 9th graders to write summaries of what they were learning in their science classes. And they asked the other half of the students to write a reflection about how what they were learning related to their own lives, why it was important in their own life. That neither the researchers nor the teachers knew which students were in which group. And then they followed up with the kids a few weeks later to see both how interested they were in their science classes and how they were performing in the class. And they found that overall, the students who had engaged in this reflection exercise were doing better in the class and were more interested. And what was cool is this was especially true for the people who had the lowest expectations for themselves, who didn't expect to like the class or didn't expect to do well. There was about a 3/4 of a grade difference, right, this difference here, in how they were performing if they had engaged in reflection about why the material was relevant to their own lives compared to just summarizing the material. So a third component that kind of starts to bridge us from these parts of social emotional imagination that are focused on the self to focused on others. This is the bridge here is the flexible identity construction. Essentially, we need to understand who we are at our core, but it's also beneficial to us to be able to conceive of our identity in a broader way, to appreciate the multiple different components of who we are and what we value. People who are better able to think about these different components of themselves are more likely to put themselves in a greater array of circumstances because they can see how they fit there. And they're more likely to make connections with a greater array of people because they can see points of overlap between themselves and those others. And these kinds of experiences of diversifying experiences are exactly what we know support creative idea generation. So one context in which constructing our identity in a flexible way is especially valuable is in averting stereotype threat. Stereotype threat effects occur when a person is concerned that an aspect of their identity relevant to this task at hand is adversely stereotyped, that people of their group are thought to do badly in that domain. And the fear of confirming the stereotype actually causes them to act in a stereotype consistent manner. That anxiety might reduce their performance and make them look like they're performing more in line with how people think they would. But what we see is that the way in which people construct their identity can help ameliorate this effect. So some of us might build a concept map of who we are that has lots of nodes, and some of us might build a concept map that has fewer nodes. But when we're able to think about these multiple different parts of who we are, when we're able to bring to mind positively stereotyped aspects of identity in the relevant domain, or just non-stereotyped aspects of identity in the relevant domain, and when we're able to focus on some of our core values, separate from just the kind of visible parts of identity, people don't show these stereotype threat effects to nearly the same extent, and sometimes they go away completely. Unless we think that this is something that would only affect other people and not us, stereotype threat effects have been shown on the basis of a number of different aspects of identity for each different racial group, for an ethnic group, and on the basis of gender and place that you're from, and the combination of different aspects of identity. And it's been shown in the context of a number of different types of abilities, academic and cognitive and physical and social. So this is something that could affect any of us at one point or another in our lives. So transitioning from these parts of social emotional imagination that have more to do with how we understand ourselves to how we understand ourselves in relation to others, I'd like to talk about perspective taking. This is our ability to imagine what another person is thinking or feeling, or imagine ourselves as that person. It sounds a lot like empathy, and that is a component of it. And again, this is a skill that we know, this process of imagining what another person's thinking or feeling is a skill that we know is supported by default mode network properties. So perspective taking facilitates academic and personal success in both obvious and non-obvious ways. What are some of the ways you can think of that perspective taking would be valuable in school settings or beyond?
Making friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Collaborative learning projects.
Yep, both.
Which translate obviously directly to workplace issues later on in life.
Yeah. Yeah, both of those are great points. It facilitates social adjustment in school, less likely to be involved in bullying, which is related to greater success in school, and greater collaborative abilities, especially the ability to work with diverse others, which again is one of the things that we know is most closely tied to creative innovation. It also helps us dig in and work hard, because when we are able to appreciate the significance of our work, for not just for ourselves, but for others, that can be a motivating force that helps us stick with it. And of course, it facilitates communication as well. If we're better able to imagine what another person is thinking or feeling, we can adjust our message to meet them where they are and make it as engaging as possible for them. And this is really a skill that's valuable, not only in everyday storytelling or in the social sciences or arts, but also in the sciences too, in communicating scientific messages. Some of the work that I've been doing recently is related to how students engage with social emotional content. We see that there are two main styles of engagement. One is a deeper, more reflective style, and the other is a shallower, more reflexive style. And this deeper engagement that involves a high degree of perspective taking is related to a number of outcomes that we care about and try to instill in students in school. When our students engage in this deeper type of reflection, we see not only that they find content more moving and meaningful and take longer to understand how they feel about it. But also it's associated with generating a larger number of creative solutions to a challenging problem. And especially relevant in the context of what schools are hoping to do, we see that this style of engagement is related to remembering content better across as much as a 5-year delay. And in the participants that I've been working with, that style of deeper engagement is related to greater connectivity, greater crosstalk in the brain between the default mode network and this hub of the salience network shown in the picture there. So the final part of social emotional imagination that I want to touch on is polycultural thinking. This is thinking informed by an awareness of multiple interacting cultures and an appreciation for those different perspectives. We see that this kind of cultural awareness is associated with creative potential and exploration to a larger extent. So for example, college students who've studied abroad upon returning perform better on tests of creativity than their peers who intend to study abroad but haven't yet done so, even controlling for things like, you know, years in college and age and that sort of thing. Bilingualism is also associated with greater creative achievement or multilingualism, as is an appreciation for the different dimensions of one's own cultural background. So among students who identify as multiracial, if they identify more strongly with all the different parts of their racial or ethnic or cultural background, they're more likely to be succeeding in school and participating and having higher self-esteem than their peers who also come from multiracial backgrounds but identify more strongly with just one of those parts of their background. So with an understanding of these different components of social emotional imagination, I'd like to transition into thinking about how we go about harnessing these skills for students. But I wanted to take a minute to pause here first to see if anyone had questions or comments that they'd like to share.
My comment is you've just articulated a vision for progressive education. I mean, pretty much what you've laid out is why schools who orient towards progressive education implement those kinds of strategies in the classroom.
Yeah, so
I mean, if you go and look at what's done in those schools, I don't know if you've visited schools like Sequoia or Walden, or some of the progressive schools in California. These are exactly the areas that they underscore for those reasons.
Great.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah,
you might want to go into some of those classrooms and see how you think they align with what you're talking about.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
Could you give an example of perspective taking in the classroom? Are there exercises that can develop that particular?
And inside the classroom or outside, and there are things that we do already. In English class, we ask, you know, what was the character thinking and why did he do that? But it's not just something that can be reserved for literature. It's also a really valuable skill in the sciences as well. So for example, if we have team teaching, if we have one student teaching another student how to, you know, whatever the concept is that's being taught in the class, it requires perspective taking and actually will support the students in learning the content better. We see that when we're learning things, knowing that we're going to have to teach it to someone else, we encode it in a way that makes the person who was learning it to teach it better able to remember it too.
I was just going to say, I just know that tends to be such a hard thing for some of our kids because they have an idea, they're passionate about their idea, they just want to communicate it, this is the way it is, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You know, so getting them to slow down, to calm, and let's make it some other idea.
Absolutely. And that's why, you
so
know,
in the doing in the classroom, you know, when you've got the other kids and they, you know, their idea is the best idea and they're moving forward, it can be challenging.
Absolutely. I I'm sure that's the case. And I think, again, that's why we need this balance. We want students to have that passion and fervor for pursuing the idea, but also to be able to kind of build consensus around it and move forward with others on board as well.
I think that there's also schools that have peer conflict resolution programs where they're engaging in problem-solving process, which is a lot of perspective.
Definitely, yeah.
There's a conflict or disputes.
Or also for disciplinary purposes, like a student-run honor board sort of thing. Yeah, great. So I was at Legoland a few months ago, and I was on one of the, they have this little boat ride, like bumper boats kind of thing. And I saw this lifeguard, and this Lego lifeguard reading a book that you probably can't make out from there, but his book says How to Swim. And I think we could probably all agree that we would hope that our lifeguard has learned to swim, not just by reading a book, but by actually practicing swimming and practicing some of the skills involved in lifeguarding. And the same principle applies to giving students opportunities to practice these social and emotional skills. They need hands-on ways to do it. One of my favorite examples of project-based learning that gave students a way to engage authentically with content was a class in the UK of 25 8 to 10 year olds. Their teacher partnered with local members of the community and a professor at the local university and had the kids conduct a real experiment. They were trying to learn something about how bees use the color of flowers to determine their foraging pattern. And the kids conducted a great study. It went on to be published in a well-respected biology academic journal. Because they found out something new about how bees forage, something that scientists didn't know previously. And what was great is, in addition to publishing their findings, the kids wrote, "Science is cool and fun because you get to do stuff that you've never done before." And that's exactly right. Science is cool and it is fun, and in its best form, you're doing stuff that no one's ever done before. But And I think because of that, these kids are very likely to remember this experience and take it with them into the future and appreciate the skills that they developed during that process. But I bet most of us can't remember a ton about the labs that we had in school, where we had a recipe of exactly what we had to do, and everyone else in the class had to follow the exact same recipe, which, by the way, was the recipe that everyone had done the year before and the year before and the year before. And we were just trying to reproduce something that was already known, rather than go about discovering something that was new. So Richard Fineman is one of the best known physicists. He made his career just a mile down the road from here. But although he's known for his work in physics, in his mid-40s, he started taking up arts. He started drawing and painting, and he was reflecting about how he was being taught in the arts versus how he behaved as he and his colleagues as a physics professor. He said that the art teacher's main objective was to inspire us to experiment. And then he said, but as a physics teacher, we never stopped telling students how to do things. So the drawing teacher has this problem of communicating how to draw by osmosis and not by instruction, while the physics teacher has this problem of always teaching technique rather than the spirit of how to go about solving physical problems. And this background here is a compilation of some of his equations and his doodles and drawings. I think that what we see in this message here is, again, the importance of balance. Certainly, there's a place for telling students how to do things. There's some knowledge that we need to communicate to students, but that needs to be balanced too with inspiring them to experiment. This is again, the executive attention network and the default mode network. Sometimes we need to draw students' attention outward and engage their executive attention network so that they can learn content. But in order for them to appreciate that content and really make it their own, we also need to give them time to step back and reflect on it and allow them to experiment. So I think that somewhere in here in this balance is where we're likely to have greatness really shine through. Another surprisingly simple but powerful thing we can do is allowing the moments of reflection that exist in students' lives anyway to exist. We probably can all think of a teacher who has said to a student taking the test, you know, the answers aren't written on the ceiling, look at your paper, or telling a student who's looking out the window to attend back to the teacher, or worst of all, a teacher who says to a student while scolding him or her, you know, look at me when I'm talking to you. But what we know is that when students are averting their gaze, they may actually be processing these difficult concepts in a more sophisticated way. They need to turn inwards to make sense of it. Here we see that this girl was just told a story like the one I told you in the beginning. As she's thinking about how she feels, she averts her gaze and looks to the side. And after she's made sense of it, she then reports again what it is that she's feeling. In the context of having to think about abstract content, we see that when people avert their gaze, they activate the default mode network. And when the network is activated, they then go on to engage in greater abstract reasoning. So just take a moment to think about how this is something that's so simple and yet could be so powerful. Just let students have the moment they need to engage more abstractly. But in reality, in classrooms, we don't make much time for this. In high school and similar, approximately similar in middle school, students spend more than 75% of their time on tasks that draw their attention outward. So taking notes and completing worksheets, and they spend less than 15% of their time working in groups or doing a kind of activity that might allow for some reflection. But what if we shifted that balance a little bit? I'm not saying completely, but what if we actually tried to strike more of a balance here so that students, the school culture allowed for reflection that might then spur creative expression? One concern with this approach of allowing for more unstructured time is that students might get bored. And to that, I would say, first of all, if you think students aren't bored in class now, you're wrong. The most frequently used description of when students are talking about how they feel in school is bored. So I think we can only go up from here, which is a good place to begin to experiment. And in the right context, boredom can actually be a really good thing. In a context where students have autonomy to experiment and to do something to alleviate their boredom, it can give rise to great curiosity. It can give rise to self-directed learning, which is exactly the type of skill that we hope to foster in students, because once they're outside of school, they'll have to be self-directed in their own learning. Yeah, in that sense, you know, if we were to couple time for more reflection with autonomy for students to experiment, it could be a good thing. And I think especially in our tech-saturated culture, this is so important. More than around 40% of adolescents have an internet addiction. They feel compelled to spend time online even when they don't necessarily, when they know that it's harming them or they wish they wouldn't. And it's no wonder, you know, phones are everywhere. The news feed is never ending. There's always another ping coming into the phone. And we never have that downtime to rest and reflect. You know, there are alarming statistics about, at least about adults, you know, who all go to the bathroom with their phone. Even in that one little moment, you're not giving yourself a break then. And this is concerning in this period of adolescence where kids are developing the reflective skills that they'll take with them into adulthood. And if we're not giving them, if in school we're constantly drawing their attention outward, and outside of school they're constantly engaging online, they never have they don't have sufficient opportunity to reflect and make meaning. So just to kind of bring this together, some of the key things that we can do to help draw out students' social, emotional, imaginative abilities. We can schedule time for reflection, include that into school schedules, school curricula, and include that into our home lives and family lives. Make explicit that we want time for that. And also capitalize on those naturally occurring reflective moments and stop the practice of inhibiting people from having those moments. We can model mindfully moving between the task-oriented and meaning-making, both in our own behavior as well as in how we cue our students or our children, telling them that now is the time to engage in reflection, and now is the time to work on the task at hand. We can also encourage them engaging in some of these imaginative practices that are part of the social emotional imagination. So in asking them about what they aspire to and helping them build a path to that, encouraging them to understand themselves at their core and to conceive of their identity broadly and be able to practice moving in and out of those different parts of who they are. And we can encourage the perspective taking by asking questions about, you know, what was your brother thinking when he did that? Or why do you think the character on the show did what he did? We can also help students build a personal narrative through storytelling. So part of this is a student's personal narrative of their own lives, their own life narrative. And part of this is capitalizing on stories to help bring home a message. You know, if we were to contextualize, for example, the idea that that the earth revolves around the sun and vice versa, by framing it in terms of what Galileo had to sacrifice in order to stand by his belief in this observation about the solar system, it might make that point all the more powerful. Stories have a way of bringing things home. And then finally, giving students meaningful opportunities to make informed choices about curricular content. As we're supporting students in building out their sense of who they are and what they care about, they will be developing their own interests. And that's a really good thing. But we've only kind of conquered half the battle if we stop at just helping them develop their interests. We also need to give them opportunities to pursue them. So allowing students choice in a scaffolded way and at every chance we can, increasingly as students get older, can help them have opportunities to practice this skill. Economists are projecting that in around 15 years, almost 50% of the jobs that currently exist will no longer exist. They'll be automated. And the jobs that will remain are jobs that require a high degree of creativity. So in that context, cultivating creativity is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And especially for our creative students who may have the greatest potential for driving the economy forward, investing in their creative potential is critical. Social emotional imagination is a big component of how we invest in their creativity. And these points that we just talked about are a big part of that. But we also have to consider their experiences. The more we can expose them to, the broader range of experiences they have, the greater opportunity for engaging in creative thinking, because they have more to draw on to synthesize in exploring creative ideas. We need to give positive feedback about students' attempts at creativity. Creativity is something that's fraught with initial failure, and that can be challenging. But when we praise the effort that goes into the pursuit, students will learn to stick with it even in those periods of initial failure. And we can inspire in them some of the qualities that we know are related to creativity. So an openness to experiencing those broad experiences that will show them, but also inspiring an attraction to complexity and autonomy and self-confidence are all things that can give students the motivation to keep going in creative pursuits. So as promised, I want to circle back to this boy that we talked about in the beginning. I asked you to talk with each other about how his story made you feel. And this is something that we do with the research participants who come into our lab at USC. I want to show you quotes from two students, and I'll tell you a little about them, and we'll look at their responses together. So one of our participants responded to this story by saying, "It's pretty intriguing that he's able to scavenge broken computer parts and put them together. That's crazy. And it's a great thing that he's promoting innovation and helping out the community like that." Another one of our participants said, "It makes me feel inspired. He inspired a lot of people, a lot of kids. He was brave. He lost his mom, but he still wanted to continue on with his life. He invented stuff. He invented his own radio show. That's pretty cool. Like, that's a young kid. Like, I can't even invent my own radio show. Like, it's really hard, not just for him. He had it all. He was really good. He was a good inventory. Inventory? And then I said inventor? Yeah, inventor. It's really good." So we collect all kinds of information about these students. And one of the things we collect is we ask them to take an IQ test. So one of these students had an IQ score in the 130 range. And one of these students had an IQ score in the 80s range. Do you guys want to take a guess at who's who? Is this kid the 130?
No. The bottom.
This kid's the 130? And this kid's the 80? No, so actually, this kid was our kid who had an IQ of 130, and this was our kid who had an IQ in the low 80s. And so what we see here is that the first participant was able to summarize the story effectively, and he was able to appreciate the impact of the boy's actions on those around him. And he even was moved by the story to some extent, right? He found it pretty crazy. But he is not actually simulating what the protagonist was thinking or feeling. He's not thinking about why that story matters for his own life or others around him. He's not letting it guide his actions going forward. And in this second student, the student with the IQ in the 80s, we see that he's sensitive to the emotional state of the boy in the story. Mm-hmm. He's able to appreciate the magnitude of what the boy accomplished, and he even does so by contextualizing it in terms of his own accomplishments or his own perceived abilities. And he's able to infer something about the boy's desires, right? He says, he understands that the boy just wanted to continue on with his life. And he even is able to infer something about the boy's personality traits. He recognizes that he was brave. And perhaps most important, this participant felt inspired by the boy's story. Inspiration is this really powerful emotion. It motivates us to action. And the fact that he felt inspired by this story suggests that it's possible that the story will cause him to reevaluate himself, his own decisions, his own lives, and could motivate him to act in a way that, you know, aligns more with his own values as a result of seeing this example. So I think, you know, for me, it makes me think, what would happen if these two participants were in a class together? If this student down here might be able to help the first appreciate the broader significance of this story and why it matters for our lives. And this participant here might be able to help the one below communicate his ideas more effectively and more fluidly, you know, help with the stumbling over the words and the repetition. And together they might really accomplish something powerful. I think that for the sake of this boy down here, we need to be thinking about how we're making decisions about who gets invited into giftedness. This boy, based on his IQ scores, would not be invited, and yet he has some real gifts that are of value. And it's for the sake of this boy up here, or this participant here, the top one, that we need to think about what's happening in gifted education and what the skills are that we are trying to instill in our students and giving them opportunities to practice. Because it should include a wider range of opportunities, including opportunities to develop these social and emotional imaginative skills. So with that, I'd just like to thank the organizations that fund the work and the folks who I work with at USC and collaborators outside of USC. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, because in our educational system, lots of kids are moving towards, schools are going towards digital learning applications and things like that to hone in on their abilities and levels. How is that impacting your ability in reflective learning? Because I really, you know, I can't get my kids off a computer, and it could be a math game, but it's so hard. Even though they're learning algebra, it's so hard to take them out of that simulated environment and have that time of reflection. And I think that's going to be really difficult going down the road when they go to middle school and they all get computers. You know?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's tricky. I don't mean to imply that there's not a place for students to be developing skills with technology. Certainly, that's important and something that will be part of their lives going forward. But it's a matter of context and quantity and the type of online engagement or computer engagement. So. A kind of simpler game that is focused and where there's, you know, constraints on the stimulation could be a really great opportunity to learn and to do so in a way that's self-paced. But what becomes more problematic is when there's just like this sensory overload that's hitting you, and there's the this feeling that it's like never ending, that there's always something more that you can't step away from, where it can become kind of trickier to figure out how to navigate that. So I think, you know, the answer isn't to not have kids using computers or phones, but just to think about what they're doing on those, as well as when they're using it. Are they able to step away and disengage at times?
But at the same time, in the classroom, they're using computers a lot more too, right? So it's not just at home, but it's when they're providing curriculum to a student, they're in front of a screen and they're doing tasks in front of a screen.
Yeah.
And that form of stimulation is so different than picking up a book and flipping through a book.
Definitely.
And I think that I'm just wondering, for not just gifted, but children in general, this stimulation, this constant stimulation, how is that really impacting their development in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work about the fact that computers facilitate multitasking, that, you know, that people who have 20 tabs open online and 12 different programs open, and you switch between one. As soon as one is loading, you switch to the other. That kind of rapid task switching can be problematic. It affects our ability to sustain attention and makes each of the tasks that we're working on take longer, and makes us less likely to remember that content across time. So that can be problematic, but again, if it's like in a more focused way, a lot of computers in schools have, the teacher can control or can see what the students are working on, and can also limit which applications are able to be opened. And so in that context where what they're doing on the computer is more constrained, it can be a very productive opportunity to learn. Does that address your question?
A little bit, but I mean, what I see is that, for example, you might have a story that's in the book or in their as part of their curriculum, and then they'll have something that's associated that's online. The kids would be more interested in something that's online to have more animation in it than the school curriculum that's in a book, right? So the worksheets are left behind, whereas they just want to do the simulated activities that are online. And I'm just wondering how that is impacting their ability to learn, but also moving forward, wanting that constant stimulation rather than having the time to be able to reflect and think more creatively.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And some of these, hopefully not the educational games, but certainly some online games like World of Warcraft is the classic example, just draw you in, and it's that constant stimulation. You just like can't put it down. And in that case, it can be very dangerous because it's hard to step away, period, let alone step away to have time to reflect.
Yeah, I mean, right now, even my kids are in elementary school, but what I see is they have math games where you have to do these multiplication tables in order to play a portion of something. So they keep doing these I mean, you're thinking, oh great, they're doing math, right? But really, it's just to get to the next level for a wizard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's maybe some perverse incentives there if you're saying that math is something you got to get out of the way in order to have the fun reward.
To get up to the next level for the wizard.
Enjoyable thing in and of itself.
Yeah. And I see a lot of educational things like that now.
Yeah. Well, plus, if it's just drilling on math facts, that's actually the lowest denominator of math education anyway.
Oh no, it's different levels of math. So
I'm just saying, math involves critical thinking and memorizing facts. Is what a lot of those programs do. Is they drill on math facts, which is really not deeper math thinking at all.
Oh, not at all.
Right.
Not at all.
I have a question about, in the last example you gave, were those IQ scores full scale or were they GAI scores?
It was, I'm not familiar with GAI.
Is this general ability index? So the full scales would include processing speed and working memory, whereas a lot of people look more closely at, they'll drop out processing speed because that's often people who are really especially creative, brilliant, actually don't process fast, they process slow. So it can be a misrepresentation of somebody's skill abilities.
We don't measure processing speed. We do measure working memory, but it's not included in the IQ. The IQ is based on two types of verbal intelligence and two types of visual spatial.
So it's more like a GAI then?
Yeah, it's the WASI, the Wechsler, I forget what it stands for. WASI. We have the WISC too, but we use it. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. It's like the alphabet soup.
Well, I think what you've posed is an extremely interesting challenge for education generally, but also gifted education, because we all know that people who are extremely creative and brilliant aren't necessarily all these stories you hear about, like John Irving, who's a brilliant novelist who thought he was an idiot because he was dyslexic and had ADHD. And yet, I defy somebody with 150 IQ who's not as creative as he is to write the novels that he wrote. So trying to quantify those things and decide And I think ultimately it throws a whole monkey wrench in this idea of where this line is and who's gifted and who's not gifted. And I think people on all sides need to maybe let go.
Yeah, and just think, I mean, ideally,
think about people and their potential.
Exactly. Ideally, what we, you know, I'm not talking about policy here or whatever. Of course, there are so many practical roadblocks to us realizing this idealized vision yet, but ideally we would be moving to a system of personalized education that is designed around people's strengths and abilities and designed to challenge, but also meet them where they are and guided by their interests as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for this. It's been incredibly insightful, at least in my own personal situation with, I have a 7-year-old son.
Thank you.
And default mode is preferred. Needs to be.
Great.
So my question for you is, and obviously you don't know my son specifically, but generally speaking for that age group and then maybe as it transitions to the upper years, when I'm giving him a new functional task, new set of skills, he'll pretty quickly go into default mode. And again, all of this is super interesting and as insight as to how his brain might be processing this new information.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the sort of workflow goes, how much do I let him go out before I have to bring him back, if that question makes any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's tricky because we can't, it's not as though default mode is like quiet time and executive attention network time is like loud time, you know, so it can be hard to know really which mode the student is in. And I think while I have talked about the need to balance these two modes, in like individual cases, we can't be guided by what's happening in the brain networks because we don't know, you know, in real time what network is activated in your son when. But as to the question of, you know, when do we kind of try to draw him out versus ask him to reflect? I think that it's a matter of, you know, what you see coming out of the work. Is he able to get his work done, and is he doing it in a way that's likely to be like long-lasting and fulfilling? The long-lasting and fulfilling part may make doing the work slower, but that could be better in the long run. So, you know, if it's just the fact that it's slow or that there is more quiet time is not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of a matter of how you're gauging whether it's yielding like longer term returns.
That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your research with us. So again, if you feel like I missed something during the presentation, I want to look back. It's going to be available on our Facebook and YouTube, which is at IA Gifted. And then next month, all of you should have received an invitation to 3 of our Gifted Support Group meetings. One of them will actually be hosted at Merman School and not here. So just to make sure, in case you are interested in that one, that will be hosted by one of our fellows from UNASA, Jim Delisle. So yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Or is it just independent?
So one of there's 2 happening on February 12th. The EFT one is not going to be live streamed, and then Jim Delisle will actually be filmed, and then it will be posted a little bit later.
Okay.
So, but that's also open to our community to attend if you are able to make it to Merman School. And then the last GSG that month will be live streamed. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Do you have a card?
Yeah.
I'm outgoing at my current school, but they did hear it.